My name is Jyoti Banerjee, and I'm here with multiple hats on. I'm interested in how technology fares, and we're certainly expecting to have an interesting conversation right now with our panel, who I'm going to introduce very briefly. But right at the start, I remember reading this account of a company called Cambridge Analytica. How many of you have heard of Cambridge Analytica? Just a few of you then. And I remember seeing the CEO of Cambridge Analytica at the time. He then had to depart his job. But I remember him saying that his company had been investigated by certain authorities in the United Kingdom, and they had passed with flying colors. What he didn't say was this was the third time they were being investigated, and basically the investigating authority in the UK had found that they didn't have the rules in place that would allow them to convict Cambridge Analytica of what they believed to have been fraudulent behavior in the polls that were taking place. So we are in a situation where a digital company can do certain things. A whole bunch of people may believe what they did in dealing with the UK referendum election was not appropriate, but the rules weren't in place that would allow that kind of behavior to be controlled in any way, because the rules apply to kind of the pre-digital age. So how do we feel about technology? How do we feel about the impact it has in our lives? How do we feel about the way technology is used, not just in terms of elections in the UK or the US or anywhere like that, but what about in the way it's used in our firms? GDPR has become a big deal, and a lot of it is about giving some protection to the consumers about their privacy and so on. So how do we feel about the way in which technology is now playing such a big part, and yet there are red lights flashing in our heads about, is this right? Is this how we wanted life to be? Where do we see it going? So we have a panel who's going to hopefully give us some insight and input on these questions. So I'm going to introduce Clara Neppel, who's European Business Operations Senior Director with IEEE, which is, I guess, the largest professional association dealing with tech issues with electronics and electrical engineers and so on. And you talked about there being something like, what, 1,200 standards that have come out of your organization relating to some of these things. So we've also got Sarah Green Broderson, who is the founder and CEO of Deemly, where you have a platform that focuses on reputation and trust, and it'd be great to hear about how we can build trust in the kind of P2P sharing economy that is becoming so prevalent in our world. And we've got Martijn Sprengers here from KPMG. Now, if any of you get too close to Martijn, I have to give you a small warning, which is that he carries around with him what looks like a USB stick. It is actually, do you have that? I do. Yeah, he's got it. It looks like a USB stick, right? It turns out that it's this little computer packed with viruses that he has personally written. Now, I don't know how someone like that could have a job which talks about ethical hacking, but that is what he's going to be sharing with us about. So I think we've got a panel that should give us insight on a variety of issues. And I'm going to start with you, Sarah. But before I do that, I'm going to try and see if we can take advantage of Slido. And right at the outset, we're going to have a poll for you. And I'd like you to look at the question that's out there on Slido. It says, is the uncontrolled development of AI? And if you don't know what AI means, I guess there's one part of me that says, what are you doing in this room anyway? But I guess we're talking artificial intelligence here. Is the uncontrolled development of artificial intelligence a threat to humanity? And you could say yes, you could say no, and you could even say, I don't know. What they left out was the option which says, I don't care. and you may feel that. But here are your options: yes, no, I don't know. And it seems we have a developing number here, which is more than half of us seem to think it's a threat to humanity. So panel members, please keep that in mind. And there's about a third who say no. And then there's a bunch who don't know. The don't care bit, we don't know about that number as yet. But I'm looking forward to seeing what you have to share. And Clara, I'm going to invite you to be the first one. We've seen movies like Terminator and The Matrix, where technology is portrayed. There's a fight for survival that's going on between the man and the machine. Is this the world we're going to expect, or is there another way of viewing what is to come?
Well, I think actually that is one of the problems that press and, of course, the media is portraying it this way. So a kind of doom scenario. But actually, AI is here. I mean, you all know it's on our iPhones. It's everywhere. And we do have the challenges with it right now. And we have to deal with these challenges today. If we talk about discrimination, probably you already heard that face recognition works very well if you're a white guy. The same would be to bring more objectivity in beauty contests. Bringing in AI, it turns out it likes more white girls. The same, coming to a little bit more serious matters, a compass system, which is an automatic decision-making system for judges, which was used in the US, also had serious problems with discrimination. And coming back more to the profession, the way we systems look at creditworthiness is also a matter of how is this assessed? For instance, one problem is, again, speaking to data scientists, the confusion between correlation and causation. So there might be a correlation between me being creditworthy and having rich friends, but it's not a causation. So if I have a rich friend, that doesn't mean automatically that I'm rich. And so these are the problems that we have to deal with today. And we at IEEE, you mentioned we have standards. We actually, probably the most known standard is the Wi-Fi standard. We are working now on ethical standards. We have 13 of them in development. And just to bring another perspective to what I just seen here, normally in my day-to-day life, it's exactly the other way around. Artificial intelligence is going to be the problem solver. It's going to solve all the challenges of humanity. And we also see that already. So we already have automatic street lights who talk to cars and automatically find, parking position and manage the traffic in order to make it smoother. You already have drones, automatic drones, a swarm of drones who detect weeds at the individual plant level, so you don't have to have the herbicides. And we can even go further. We can have an automatically managed forest who, more or less determines with the drones which trees it would like to be cut. It can sell that using cryptocurrencies and do this whole thing automatically. So that's what you call a distributed automated organization. And of course, this is a forest, but you can do this for an organization. So you can have automatically that contract, everything done, accounting done automatically as well. So the question is, what is then the role of the manager, of the accountant, and so on? Everything is going to be done automatically. We don't think so. So I think, especially in these really automized societies, we need trust. I think I agree with what was said before, and the trust has to come from humans. So the human in the loop is something that is also our mantra. It is a human-centric design, and I think accountants have an important role in that scenario.
Excellent. Well, thank you for that. So does that mean I really have no chance in a beauty contest?
With
You know,
our
I'm not going to
standards,
take
yes.
that white girl option. All right, okay. Well, so that's one view, which is that AI does bring positives. It does have its negative issues. Martijn, we're going to have a quick question of you as well. But before we do that, could we just go to Slido? Because we have another question of you. I know I did mention ethical hacking a sentence before, so really all of you should say 100% yes, you'd heard of it. But in a sense, had you come across the term before? Have you ever heard of ethical hacking? And the answer is that we seem to be at about 2/3 to a third no, actually. The no's are having a strong push at the end. Okay, so we're probably 40-60 on ethical hacking. So I suspect what the audience is doing is not just have you heard of it, but they don't want me to go and say, okay, so you say you've heard of it, tell me what it means. So they're probably defensive on that measure. So Martijn, you're at KPMG and you're an information securities advisor. You have come across the Hacker Manifesto, of course. Yep. For a lot of people, that was the kind of ethical defense that was on offer. But surely the Hacker Manifesto is out of date today, or is it not?
Well, looking at the results here, 60-40, there's clearly a trend in what is ethical hacking, what is white hat hacking, what is black hat hacking, what is professional hacking. Basically, if you grasp back the Hacking Manifesto, which was written by one of the early hackers in 1986, even before my birth, they reasoned that hacking is specifically being curious. So we're all, the author said, we're all alike, we're all very curious and want to break into system just to show the defects of the system, not to cause harm. Well, if you fast forward 30 years, hacking has now been loaded with a different notion, basically. If you now look at hackers, you have multiple ways to look at them. So they're not only, you still have the curious children, like 12 to 18 years, that try to break into systems just to show off, basically. I did that when I was young. I hacked into computer games just to show off to my friends. And after that, I started to become a professional hacker. So it's actually my profession to break into computer systems. But I would never do that if I don't have the authorization to do that. So I think many of the intelligence agencies in, well, especially the Western world, every year they have an assessment of digital threat actors. And of course, one of these threat actors are hackers, or we call them script kiddies, basically. Just people like me, when I was young, tried to break into systems to show off. But you have many more types of threat actors, digital threat actors currently. And there's a thin line between if you do hacking for good or for bad. So actually today in Dutch Parliament, a law will be passed that says that police and the public prosecutor are also allowed to hack into systems if that helps their case. Basically, they need to do that with tools they need to buy in, well, very shady places in the internet, because you cannot legally get them, basically. And these tools actually exploit weaknesses in systems, which, on the other hand, the government says, well, if you find weaknesses in systems, you should report them immediately. But right now, they use these weaknesses to break into systems. So that's a very thin line. What also has changed from 30 years ago until recently is the economies of scale. So where hackers used to be on their own or in a small group of people, they're currently trying to find ways to monetize that. Who hasn't heard about ransomware? Everybody knows ransomware? Yeah? Good. So ransomware basically locks your computer and asks for a ransom in terms of bitcoins or money. If you pay, would you get your files back? Say hands up if you say yes. Nobody thinks they get their files back. Well, actually, it's very funny, because in most cases, for most ransomware, you do get your files back. Why? Because the hackers or cyber criminals want to be trustworthy. There's so many out there, they need to compete with each other. So if you crack somebody's computer, lock the files, and you ask for 300 euros, and you don't get your files back, people will only do that once. They will pay once, and that's it. But if you do it really well, you can get more out of this. The next time, you just ask a little bit less or a little bit more, depending on the files that you encrypt. You can even use AI for that, if you're an attacker, if you want to find out if you have like very good files that you need to encrypt from a perspective of the user, such they are willing to pay more. Even worse, they have developed economies of scales in such a way that marketing research that ransomware, for example, let's say Philippines. Ransomware in the Philippines would ask less money to get your files back than, for example, Belgium, because they have lower standards, lower gross domestic income. And actually, I have an example. Well, I don't have any slides, but there's an example of somebody from the Philippines complaining that the amount of money is too high, so he cannot pay it because it's a month's loan or a month's pay. And he sends the creators of the ransomware message saying, hey, I cannot pay this. Is there any way I could pay less? And then the ransomware creators respond with, well, our marketing team didn't do a very good research on your country. We should have lowered the price. For this time, we will decrypt your files. But by the way, if you like our service, please donate now via PayPal. So this is the world that we have become living in. And actually, to take it back to the trust and ethics, there's this very thin line. So people, at some point, operating as just individual hackers for their own gain, at some other point are hired by governments to break into other people's computers or companies' computers. So I would rather not say ethical hacking, because the line is very thin on what is ethical and what's not. And it's also, for prosecutors, very hard, one, to prove if somebody breaks into a system, so the attribution aspect. And on the other hand, for hackers, it's much more easy, like I showed you before, to have asymmetric advantage. And what I mean with asymmetric advantage, I mean with this USB stick, if I plug it into a computer, for example, a company network's computer, I can get access to many computers, because I know the viruses I created will probably work on many systems. So on my own, I can do a lot of harm. So that's the asymmetric part, which wasn't there yet back in 1980s. So that is basically a short summary of what happened in the last 30 years.
So is your advice that someone should hire a professional hacker to break their systems? Or is your advice that there is another way to do it?
There's multiple ways to do that. Of course, hiring a professional hacker is, from a security perspective, a very good idea, because you quickly get insights into what are my main weak points. However, a hacker only needs one entrance. As a defender, you need to defend all entrances, basically. So it's not only about hiring hackers, it's about the balance between implementing policies or making sure your users do the right thing in your companies, but also balancing your efforts in terms of responsive, detective, and preventive measures. And hacking is mainly about detecting holes in your preventive measures that you take.
And how do you differentiate between the advice you'd give to a company and the advice you'd give to individuals? Because, you know, every company is made up of a whole bunch of individuals as well.
Yeah. I always say, if you're an individual, don't worry too much. I think ransomware is the most, or the worst thing that can probably happen, or digital theft of your identity. Yes, that's bad. But I think for companies and for governments, the impact can be much higher. So it's all about impact. So determine the impact.
Okay, well, we'll get a chance to come back and ask you some more questions. But Sarah, I'm going to go to you. And you operate in a world, you're the founder and CEO of Deemly, and you provide trust solutions in P2P markets. I assume when I think of a marketplace, I think of multiple types of participants in a market, and especially in our virtual markets, we don't even know who these people are, where they're from, what their records are.
Yeah.
How do you go about providing trust in that kind of crazy environment?
Well, I think that the first comment to that is that trust is arbitrary and very, very complex. We obviously have a technology solution that sort of enhances that or helps build trust between strangers. But what we see, and we focus mostly on the sharing economy, I don't know if all of you are sort of familiar with that, but as an example, how many have used Airbnb in here? How many have stayed in an Airbnb? Okay, good. But basically, if you'd allow me to be a little academic in this, the way I sort of explain trust in the sharing economy is that there are sort of 3 levels that needs to be fulfilled for a user to go into this sharing transaction. So let's say that I am coming to you, I want to stay in your house instead of booking a hotel. So the first notion that needs to be fulfilled is the level of trusting the concept. So basically, I need to assess, is this a viable solution for me to stay with someone in a private home rather than in a hotel?
And especially when you see my picture as a white girl.
Yeah. We can identify that. Yeah, that would be fraud. No, so basically, that level can be fulfilled by that it's a notion in society that people actually do, that it's legal. I mean, Airbnb has sort of been scrutinized in some cities where it's not even legal anymore. But let's say that's all in place, and this is something that my friends and family are doing. So I can assess that that's something I would do. Then I need to trust that the company or the platform facilitating this is trustworthy. So does Airbnb take care of me if something happens? Do they have 24-hour support? Do they have insurance? All these things that makes a trustworthy company. But then it comes down to the fact, do I trust you to be my host? And that's where we really assess what is the likelihood of you being a trustworthy person based on your previous interactions. And if we dive into sort of the research in this topic, we can see that there's been a lot of analysis on what actually makes a person trustworthy online when we see their profiles. And specifically for Airbnb, we know that the ratings and reviews we leave when we stayed with someone. So if you've had 10 other guests staying and they said, yeah, he's a great guy, I will trust you more. And then the second thing is actually the photos, right? So if we have a photo of someone, we can assess the trustworthiness of that. And so on. And there's a lot more features that you can go into the details of that. And that's sort of the system that we create to help marketplaces develop a trustworthy technology around that. It's not a perfect system, but it helps.
So you're checking the buyer, you're checking the platform, and presumably the sellers.
So we check the individuals, so the buyers and sellers, and then we advise the platforms on how to build their system for a trustworthy interaction.
Excellent. All right. Now, we're going to take a break from getting them to present to us, and we're going to ask them questions. And so I'm going to move to the Slido thing, and someone's already put a question there, and this is your chance to ask questions. So if you haven't already got a question put down on Slido, which I think for most of you the answer is no, you haven't done it, but there are some questions that are coming up here. And the first question says, are there ethical standards for ethical hackers? Now, Martijn, you've questioned the idea of an ethical hacker anyway, but are there ethical standards? Clara, you talk about them as well, don't you? So maybe you should have a go first, since you're putting these standards in place.
As you mentioned, we are a professional association, so we have more than 400,000 members worldwide. So as an association, we see the ethics in 3 dimensions. One is our own ethical standards, so as an individual. The other would be how we act in an organization, so preventing things like the VW scandal, for instance. And the third one would be ethical considerations of the technology itself, like artificial intelligence. And this first one, I think the ethical standards for ethical hackers would be probably the individual standard, the code of conduct, if you want so. And this is something that we also have, and probably other organizations as well.
Yeah, we have our own, for example, within KPMG, we have a code of conduct, but for our unit that performs these kind of activities, we have an additional code of conduct, or ways of working, basically, and standard operating procedures. But by far as I know, that these are not internationally available yet. However, if you're a company, you could still work with a notion of responsible disclosure, in which you actually invite people with your house rules, basically, to invite people to hack your systems, and if they find something, to report it to you first. It's called responsible disclosure, and a lot of companies are doing that. It's easy to set up, but not always easy to manage. Yeah. I'll talk about that a bit in the second part also.
Okay, thank you. So we have some more questions here. I'm looking at question 3 out there. Is artificial intelligence the right term? How about augmented intelligence? So we're not saying man versus machine, but it's man versus man with a machine. So do you want to talk about how we should be viewing this? Is artificial intelligence perhaps the wrong use of the term there?
I don't think I'm an expert on artificial intelligence. So no,
but
honestly,
you're providing intelligence
sure,
to,
yeah. So
to
I guess
people that help them
sure
make better decisions.
I guess right. So analyzing, big data is also part of artificial intelligence, and sort of analyzing and using algorithms for that. And obviously, we can also predict, based on previous behavior, how trustworthy you might be in the future. So yes, there is some kind of intelligence. I think for us in our product, it's important to say that it's not a perfect system, and we can't guarantee that people will be trustworthy. But it helps foster sort of a sense of responsibility and credibility. Yeah.
Clara.
So I can very much endorse that. We actually don't use that term at all. So if you look into our initiative, it's not using artificial intelligence. We use another term, which is also debatable, but it's about autonomous and intelligent systems. I think what's important, it's autonomous and systems. Intelligence is always a problem, but it's important to say we are talking about systems, actually. So it's not intelligence that we want to replace in an artificial manner, but probably augmenting and taking the system view.
I remember as a child reading Isaac Asimov's I, Robot and all of that, where there were the 3 laws of robotics that prevent the robots from getting out of control, and that's that's the first one there. So clearly, some of the science fiction stuff is actually is here already. All right, there's a question up there that that's getting some support, which says, should IFAC put in the Code of Ethics for Professional Accountants to address this area? I know you folks aren't representing IFAC here, but do you think it's a good idea for accountants to have a code of ethics being put into their professional work? We'll ask IFAC that same question shortly after.
Well, I think my personal opinion, maybe not that of KPMG, but my personal opinion, I would say yes. Specifically, as in a previous presentation by Philippe, it was about the trust and the ethics that need to be implemented or can be implemented through accountancy firms, which basically are in a unique position to oversee other firms and other organizations. And I think we are responsible to society not only for checking the financial statement audits, but maybe also for technology audits, or the way the society deals with technology.
Well, the whole idea of assurance is developing so that it's not just information, but the systems that produce that information. And if those systems are not trustworthy, then where are we with audit and assurance?
Yeah, exactly. And I think that this has already been long there. So third-party assurance at the third-party attestations, like ISA 3402, those kind of standards are already out there, but I think we can still enforce them. Sorry, not enforce them, but strengthen them with these new technology developments.
Okay, I'm going to take a break from Slido at the moment because I want to come back to the presentations that you're doing. But we'll keep your questions running, and if questions come up, we'll come back to them later. So we'll have a second opportunity to ask some questions. But Martijn, I'm going to start with you. Let's say we have a company here that has heard you talk about hacking and how you might use it. How do you go about finding someone that you can trust to do this kind of work for you? Because the potential for it to go badly wrong is also quite significant. So how do you begin that process of finding someone, knowing how to trust them, etc.?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question. So usually the way we are hired is either through consultancy or through accountancy. However, if you are a company and want to find out your weak spots, there's multiple ways to go. One, you can do it, of course, internally, so do it yourself. For example, ask your IT department to do it, which could help because they know your systems best. You can organize a hackathon, for example, to get a bit familiar with the notions of breaking into systems, and you keep it very close to yourself. However, if you're really large and you want professional advice, you can hire consultancy firms or accountancy firms, but specifically look for firms that have established a good reputation, and especially ask for firms that can show you the impact. Because if you do I'm not going to say ethical hacking again, but we call it penetration testing or professional hacking. If you do that, you usually come up with a bunch of findings, right? There's a bunch of findings, and some are very important, others are not. But especially if that relates to your business, make sure you find somebody that can articulate that risk to the business impact that it might have. Because, for example, let's say, if you have a web server, which is not very important to your company, but it has really bad vulnerabilities, maybe you shouldn't do anything with it. But if you have a firm that says, yeah, it's a red flag, you can also cause some panic in the companies, in the organization itself. We have seen in the past few years that is really important, that you always tie it back to, okay, what is my business process, and what does it mean for my business process if I have vulnerabilities? On the other hand, we also get more and more requests from an audit angle. So our audit colleagues actually ask us, as part of the financial statement audit, to perform these kind of activities. And that's actually very funny, because on the one hand, they also try out new developments like these. On the other hand, if we then have any findings, for example, if I can break into an ERP system, an enterprise resource planning system, which is very important from an audit perspective, and can change, for example, the general ledger, that means that you cannot trust the account anymore, right? However, is that really material to your organization? I've had many discussions the last few years from an audit perspective, if something is material or not. Because if you're able to detect fraud caused by professional or ethical or non-ethical hacking, but you still report on it, what does that mean? Right? So there's a lot of still uncharted territory here to determine what's the right balance in putting this into your organization. The last one, which I already spoke about, is do it yourself, but then invite others to do it. However, that not always closes all gaps. For example, if you ask in a responsible disclosure process, ask other people to hack you and report on vulnerabilities, those people usually only look at the company from the outside, while many attacks also originate from the inside. So if you also want to have a full picture, you also need to make sure that you simulate actual attacks also from the inside. So it's again the combination that you need to take into account. But before you start, always assess what is important to my company? Because if you want to do a penetration test on all the systems that you have, and a typical Fortune 500 companies can have millions of systems, well, yeah, you won't get any value out of it. So really determine first, so what's important and what do I want to get out of it? And then only start assessing.
Actually, I said I'm not picking up on Slido, but there is a question here on Slido which is interesting in this context, which is, it says, are professional ethics relevant any longer when, as the Airbnb example shows, we're readier to trust groups of strangers more than experts? So there's the whole idea of the wisdom of crowds, which I guess, Sarah, that's part of where your stuff comes in, is you're capturing the wisdom of crowds. So is wisdom of crowds a better route, or is it another route compared to a professional hacker?
I would say another route, because you have very good initiatives like HackerOne, which is basically a platform that, like Airbnb, where you can subscribe, and then the ethical or professional hackers are screened by HackerOne, and then they are matched to your organization so they can help you perform these kind of activities. There's also a lot of standards out there or certifications which you can look into if you want to engage a professional hacker. For example, I hold myself GICSP, GPAM certifications, but there's many more of those. And a lot of governments also specifically ask for these. For example, in the UK, if you want to do a penetration test on a bank, you need to be CREST certified. So the combination makes it the most trustworthy.
Excellent. Well, Clara, I know that IEEE has brought out this whole treatise on the ethics of autonomous systems and so on. Can you share something with us about that so that we understand what you're offering us?
Well, a treaty is an interesting word.
Treatise.
I hope it's more than a treaty. It's true that it's quite thick, but actually it's something that started 2 years ago. Since we are an association of professionals, our motto is, before the AI age, was advancing technology for the benefit of humanity. And it's also a little bit the question, where do you want to go as a humanity? So especially if you look into AI, this is, I think, already a question which goes beyond technology. And we started this initiative basically to bring in the discussion between the technologists and the other parties, policymakers, ethicists, accountants, and so on, legal professionals, to see what are the challenges and also how can we solve that challenges. So not only to look into, oh, there are problems with transparency and AI is a black box, but actually what can we do about it? And so from out of this treaty, as you mentioned, there are certain recommendations which came, some for us, but also a lot of recommendations for policymakers, for people who can actually decide and set up some principles. And we already, we were selected now to be part of the high-level expert group on AI from the Commission. We were also working with the UN, with the OECD, with the House of Lords, and so on, because we see that there is a need to have that discussion, and probably there's a need to have a discussion with your profession as well, because what we see is that certain things will not happen by crowd and by ethics and so on, so just imposing ethics. I think certain things will need to be certified, to be checked and certified. And also these issues that I referred to before, the white girl problem. It's normally it's not something that they do intentionally. What happens is, of course, the speed to market, what was mentioned before. Of course, if you can be the first with some sort of solution, you will go to the market and hopefully eat the other fish. The thing is, maybe it's not such a big impact in a beauty contest, but if it's an autonomous car or something which has to do with our mental health, maybe it does matter. And we think that there are certain checks have to be made. And these will be based on standards, and somebody has to perform those checks, which can be the accountants or some other profession which has to do that. So I think that actually there is the need of the dialogue and setting up also the demand So come to us and say, this is where we think there's a gap, and we can set up a standard based on our discussion. Also looking into the transparency issue, I think that it's of course, you would not like to look into the black box of an AI system. But you would like to know maybe certain levels of transparency in the sense, some of them, like for certification authorities, something like liability is very important. So audit trails, I think, will be very important, especially in self-learning systems. You just don't know what's happening, so you have to make sure that everything is going to be made as well as possible, and if something goes wrong, the audit trail will be very important. So I think, again, very important role for you. And then another level of transparency will be needed even for the public. I mean, we heard Facebook solving a lot of problems they have with AI. So probably people would like to see, how is this done? What kind of objectives are there set? So how are we going to get now our content, and how are the recommendations? Again, these are certain levels of transparency where you as accountants will have some level and others will have other levels, and these are standards which have to be set up and then carried out. So that's, I think, where we can and should discuss. So it's more than a treaty, I hope.
It sounds
it's something very, very practical.
But it sounds to me like when you're talking about the trustworthiness of a system and the individuals participating in it, then you might need to have the collaboration and the cooperation of the professional bodies that are involved for that particular system. So it sounds like there might be need, for example, to work with accountants quite closely to work out what would be the appropriate ethical standards.
We cannot do it alone, and probably you cannot do it alone. So we have to do it together. Probably you have to come with the demand. What kind of trust is the market looking for, or the regulation looking for, and we can work together to build those standards.
So Olivier, this is something for you to pay attention to. If you come with a request, Clara is open to queries on this score. Okay. That's why we have a coffee break. Okay, so we'll try and make sure something gets done over lunch. If I could just shift to you, Sarah. You're talking about having systems in place that allow a particular platform to be dealt with. I've heard that in China, they're putting together like a national system. In effect, it's a national platform which will allow you to be judged on whether you should get a mortgage or how trustworthy you are. Is that really an appropriate way to go, or do you think there are merits there that we should be exploring?
So I'm not going to defend the system, but I think it's important to look at why was this put in place and what is the ecosystem or country that it's coming out of, and also what is facts being reported by the Western media and what is actually the truth. So there's a lot of topics on this. If we start with why it's being implemented, China is doing this to combat corruption. So obviously they have a lot of issues with the public not trusting government institutions. And so they're actually not only doing this for citizens themselves, but also for institutions, government bodies, educational institutions, and so on. So everyone is being encouraged to be more transparent. And so that is the idea, that if we share more information about how everyone interacts, both citizens and the government, then that fosters a more trustworthy society, or at least it tries to push people to be more credible and have a higher integrity. So that is the basis for why this is being rolled out. Now, on sort of the penalizing side, on, it's been reported that you can't fly or you're not going to get a mortgage and so on. What is actually the truth is that, if you are found to break any laws according to this system, you still go through a legal process where a judge will assess whether you've breached those certain rules. And if you are penalized in that sense, then there will be limits to how much you can fly and so on. So there's sort of a gray space. It's not just you will never fly again. So I think there's just, we have to look at, is this the truth, and how is this perceived in China, where obviously this is a different country than what we perceive in the West. Obviously that doesn't mean it's not scary to look at it in that way, but I'm not going to conclude anything. And I think what is interesting, I talked to a journalist who was looking into this as well, and what he found was that a lot of Western companies are actually assessing their customers. So Amazon, for example, have a score or some sort of assessment of every customer that they have. And so they will use that for marketing purposes. But it also means that some will get better discounts than others. Is that, a step in the direction of a social credit score? So I think we also need to look at us ourselves and say what is actually happening and how are we using this type of data.
So, in effect, I'm hearing you say that there is a kind of system that is being put in place in China, which is apparent for all to see and has issues and questions and so on. But perhaps even we have systems that are working in the background, like insurance companies picking up health data and driving data. Yeah, predictive policing. I think there's a movie about that, isn't there?
Probably, yeah.
So I remember, was it Keanu Reeves who was who was going after? I can't remember actually.
Yeah.
I'm sure on Slido somebody will inform us about that. But it seems that if we have these sort of systems that are hidden, is that a better way or a worse way? Do we make them more explicit?
Well, I mean, something that we looked at closely is the GDPR, and transparency is a big part of that. So I believe that any user or customer of any company or government, so citizen, should be able to know what data anyone holds about them and how it's being used. So from my point of view, I think transparency is very important. Yeah.
Okay, and Clara, I guess you're talking about systems that are applicable across industries and so on. How do you see this kind of the potential for that kind of system being put in place? That's actually, it's out there, we're just not aware of it and we don't understand how it works.
Well, actually, we really see that the most important threat. I mean, if you don't have the control over our data, we don't have the control of our identity. We can even go so far to say then we are slaves. We don't know what's happening with yourself and how you're manipulated. A big part of the work and the treaty that you mentioned is about how to regain autonomy, the agency over your data, and how GDPR is, of course, one step towards this, but it's still maybe not the right thing. I mean, even the consent for the moment is very binary. Either you say yes, and then you can use the services, or you say no, and there is no service at all. So, and I don't know how many of you have just said yes to everything that you got in the last weeks. I certainly did to a lot of that. So, I probably gave away a lot of my data already. There could be ways to do that differently. We could have some personal terms and conditions. We can put them in the machine-readable form somewhere, and we can have even a personal AI agent who kind of looks at online or real time when an automatic system tries to use your data and gives it or certain part of it away as you have defined it at the beginning, and reports back on how your data was used. So this is just one idea of a possible technical solution. But certainly I think that data is the big thing. So it's probably also, we're thinking about the agency, but it's also about the value. So again, coming back, I'm trying to make this relevant to you. And I think that the biggest value that companies will be in the data. So the question is how you will have also new metrics, on data valuation, and also what we hear more and more is how to get new metrics on economic success. So one would be the economic success, but we see more and more, especially in these complicated and complex systems, on what impact they have on our society, on the environment, and on us and individuals. So you hear more and more talks of more complex metrics to make it possible to make a comparison between solutions. So the one which is, let's say, fast and can go very fast and can get this first mover advantage and, of course, economic value very quickly, or the other one who also takes other things into account. And I think on the long run, we have to deal with these kind of new metrics that you will also be confronted with. So data and new metrics, I think, is something that you should think of in the future.
Can you give me an example of a new metric that you're talking about?
Well, there are already some around. So the OECD had something, or there are a lot of things, like the Better Life Index, where the UN also has, the different things that have to be taken into account. So the art will be how to make this manageable, something that can be then used in a practical way. Again, the thing is, how can you take into account this impact on not only economic value, but also on, as I said, on society? So a best example would be if you have something which consumes a lot of energy. It's something you can say, well, it consumes energy, and in this sense, like in a traffic jam, you have to buy fuel. So in that sense, it's contributing to GDP in that sense. Yeah? But if you say we are looking into the environment criteria as well, that's probably not a good solution. So this is just an extreme. But we have to work on that as we go. So probably to set up new metrics, because otherwise you will probably always have the fast mover advantage. And we will... correcting later on is very difficult in these self-learning systems. So this is something that is also new. There might be that with these new technologies, we only have the chance to do it once right. That's something that this is a new way for us to learn as well, because we as mankind did it always, we learned with the fire, and then we had a fire extinguisher and so on. Maybe we will not have a fire extinguisher with this fast-moving technology anymore.
Well, I certainly am guilty of having said yes to loads of queries that came. Do you want to use the system? Yes. Then I thought, wait a minute, what am I saying yes to? So then on one system, I looked in, and they had flash cookies, performance cookies, design cookies, this, that, and the other, and then, of course, tracking cookies of all sorts. And if I thought, okay, I'm going to say no, let's just see what happens. So I kept unclicking. The tracking cookies, there were 139 boxes, so I lost the will to live at that point. And I said, no, I can't do this. But we've got to the point where we have what seems to be protection, but is it really protecting us then?
Yeah. So
that's actually quite funny, because you now refer to you can also download tools that block those tracking cookies for you. So there's this funny paradox that says, on one hand, mankind has so much ways to anonymize themselves on the internet, for example, with the Tor browser, or communicate securely. For example, if you have an iPhone, a very recent operating system, so the newest version of the iPhone, and you use Telegram, you can quite securely communicate without the government eavesdropping. But on the other hand of the paradox, you have the government having more and more ways to actually interfere with your communications, and that's actually always a cat and mouse game. But you're never sure who's ahead, actually. And that also also holds true, for example, for tracking cookies.
All right. Well, this is a chance for you folks to ask your questions again. I can see there have been questions that have been coming up. But we're going to go to a little poll that we want to ask you. And here's our question. When do you think scoring individuals on their trustworthiness is useful? When you're selecting a service provider, in the sharing economy, for personal interaction, example, dating. I don't know where accountants rate on the dating scale. Oh, dating's high. Okay. In all aspects of social life, never, or I've not yet made up my mind. So when do you think scoring individuals on their trustworthiness is useful? Go ahead and give us your view. And you can answer twice, it seems.
Might have to go into dating now.
Yeah, I think it's obviously a new service line for Deemly.
Yeah. Oh, I don't know about the ethics in that yet.
Okay, so when do you think scoring individuals on their trustworthiness is useful, and both selecting a service provider and in the sharing economy are rating highly, but even personal interactions remain strong? So I guess I don't know how wisdom of crowds fares on dating.
Well,
Would that work?
Well, I mean, I know that some of my girlfriends have dated the same guy I met on Tinder, so.
Okay.
I don't know.
A
Yeah, I
question
don't know.
for
Forget
lunch
that.
research.
Yeah.
perhaps.
Just getting way off track. Yeah.
All right. So we'll go back to the questions that you have. And there's a question right at the top which has had a number of you, putting a thumbs up against it. And I think it's going back to the first laws of robotics. It says, could you imagine that robots get out of human control by training themselves? So, no, we're not going to be happy with a yes answer. What do we do about it?
Well, I think it's again about the objectives that you would give the robots to train. We already have actually. So there is scientifically proved, if you want so, that AI systems train themselves out of range. So after a certain time, the accuracy is rising, and after a certain time of training, it's lowering again. So what can we do about it? First, in the design phase, you have to take into account also what possible implications this technology can have. So, the classical example, if you train the robot to clean the house, and that's the only objective, at some point, an extreme case, it can train to eliminate everything which is doing garbage. So the humans inclusive and the cat and so on. So that's the extreme example. But it shows that you have to take into account what does it mean to extreme to pursue that objective. And the way we see it, and it's also a standard, it's in the design phase, take into account also the values or possible implications that the technology can have. It would be like an ISO 9000 for ethics. And so that's at the beginning. And in the end, so that would mean still don't mean that we are safe. There's probably need for certification. So certification, like they are already starting to have like reference data sets, so that we know from the beginning where we would like the system to operate on, and regularly looking if it's still in the range that we would like to have it to have. And so there are certainly some technological solutions to that, but this can happen. Yes, it's already happening.
Martijn, are robots going to take over?
I'm not yet, I think. Specifically because if you look at computer science, we are very far with developments, but on the other hand, robotics are still very good at doing one task. For example, playing chess. They can play better chess than humans can. However, that's only one specific task. So you need to train them to be multitasked. And that's very hard because in the end, it's still right now, I'm not saying anything about the future, but right now it's about statistics. So the algorithms that do it based on statistics. For example, if you bring this notion to my field of play, security, then you would say that a robot can find all vulnerabilities, right? Well, so far, that's not yet proven, because on the other hand, you cannot prove that a system is secure. Because that's one of the oldest notions of computer science by Alan Turing. It says a computer cannot determine if another computer with some specific kind of code can halt. It's called the halting problem, meaning that can one computer decide on the other computer what's going to do, and that is not yet solved. So yeah, there's still some hurdles to take before this is really becoming practice, basically.
I was not talking about general superintelligence, but out of control means out of control of what it was designed for. So I think that's already reality, because it can happen that you design for a certain objective in mind and it's doing something different. Because it got out of control, the consequences were not... I mean, we already have it with the recommendation systems, which have also, it's out of control in certain sense. So that we have these problems with the voting systems and so on. So if you think that was maybe a good intention at the beginning, and the designers say, if we knew that or we did not think of the all possible consequences, we would have designed it differently. So I think that's the most classical example of how it went wrong already.
So unintended consequences
Yes.
are rife
Yes.
in this kind of situation. Okay, let's see if we have any other questions anymore. We've already looked at are professional ethics relevant any longer? We've asked about ethical standards. We've asked the question about IFAC, but we'll have to actually ask IFAC whether they should do that. And there's a question, can you hack any organization if you spend enough money on the hacking team?
I would say yes, actually, because I always say hacking is very easy. So getting into a system, I think everybody can learn that. However, getting away with it, so making sure the attack is not attributed to you as a natural person, that's very hard. However, last year we have all seen the Petya and WannaCry attack. Everybody knows what I'm talking about. So the real large outbreak of viruses which caused some havoc in UK hospitals, for example. Actually, that virus originated from an exploit, which is basically a piece of code that you can use to break into systems, that was released by the shadow brokers, which is a group of, we don't know who. And actually that was a leak.
It wasn't KPMG then.
It wasn't KPMG, no. But on the other hand, probably the leak of this exploit was with the NSA. And the shadow broker team released to the public before Microsoft could patch it. So basically meaning this was a zero-day attack. So you could just break into any Windows system with this piece of code. And that's what the virus did, actually. Luckily, we didn't have a global outbreak. But yeah, there are more of these 0 days. And if you have enough of them, you can hack into any organization. However, it's much easier to trick people to do something, because if you have a very secure organization, it's still run by people, right? So you can better hack people. That's much cheaper than finding or selling or buying a 0 day.
So we're going to take one more question here. It says, in the long term, will it be possible to control where our data is, who accesses it, and what kind of analyses are done with our data? Clara, I guess this is in your territory.
Well, there is, again, I'm referring already to some existing examples. Estonia is probably known to everybody. They are trying to set this up. They have a kind of a blockchain for everybody. And so a lot of data is on that system, and each time that somebody is accessing the data, including police and so on, you are notified. So that is a first attempt. I think that there are going to be others as well. But basically, we see different models right now also in the world. We have the one Chinese model where the government has the control more or less of all the data. The other would be the American solution where the corporations have the control. And hopefully we will have another model here in Europe where we have the control over our data. And I think it's also... Well, we being the individuals.
Okay.
Yes, yes.
Right.
So that's what I was referring
It
to.
was interesting seeing the comment that came from I think it was Eric Schmidt at Google when he was asked is it right for Google to have all this information, and his response was something on the lines of, well, would you prefer the entrepreneur to have it or government? With a clear view that government having it is a bad thing, whereas perhaps
And the third
the
solution was
entrepreneur
not.
having it may not be such a great idea either.
Exactly.
So,
Yeah.
okay. Well, before we say thank you, I'm going to look at you, Floris, because perhaps there's an opportunity to pick up on some of your images. Have you had the chance to get an image out of this? All right. Let's see. Is it too late to decline the user agreement? Well, is that Martijn?
I'm not dressed like that. But
Oh, okay. You don't have to put on a special hacker costume. Fantastic. Oh, there's one which has your name in it. Right. There we go. Identity theft was a bigger problem then. Good. Well, thank you very much for that insight that we have on this conversation. But I hope you would join me in thanking our panel for a really insightful conversation about ethics and technology and where we might be going with it. Thank you very much.